Any Christian who's out on the streets engaged in public evangelism, certainly the open-air preacher, is going to have opportunity, maybe many opportunities, to interact with law enforcement. And how should the open-air preacher go about interacting with governing authorities when they come in contact with them on the streets? Well, by way of reference, Romans 13, beginning in verse 1, tells us every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those who exist have been appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists that authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of that authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword in vain, for it is a minister of God, an avenger, who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. In the times, my friends, that we're living today, we are seeing governing authorities go to unprecedented lengths, at least here in the Western world, in the Western Hemisphere, in North America, in the United States and in Canada and places like that, going to extraordinary lengths to subvert the proclamation of the gospel, not only on the streets, but in pulpits like this one, in churches, locking church doors, putting fences around church buildings, arresting pastors and holding them for extended periods of time without trial, and then releasing them after a time. Using helicopters in some cases to try to find churches not in China, not in the Middle East, not in Colombia, but in Canada, using helicopters to try to find churches that are meeting in the open air in secret to avoid detection by the governing authorities. These are things we read about in the Bible. These are things that we read about missionaries in third world countries. But today we're reading it about pastors in places like Alberta, Canada, and elsewhere. So probably today, more than ever before, at least for this current generation of open-air preachers, you are probably more likely to have contact with law enforcement. Yes, we are to submit to the governing authorities, but that does not mean, that text in Romans 13 does not mean that we should submit to Caesar simply because his name is Caesar. Those governing authorities are tasked by God to promote what is good and to punish what is evil. And oftentimes, sadly, these days, particularly when it comes to the church, when it comes to the gathering of God's people, when it comes to the public proclamation of the gospel, we see governing authorities punishing good and promoting that which is evil, doing the exact opposite of what God requires of governing authorities. I've been saddened, though, by some of the responses I have seen from not only open-air preachers, but men who serve as pastors, where almost the immediate knee-jerk response of the Christian is to scream, Nazi, fascist, tyranny, and to call the officer names, to immediately question the officer's character. Even his manhood in some cases, simply because that the officer is enforcing the law. Now, it might very well be an unjust law. He might be punishing evil and not promoting, or he might be punishing good and promoting evil. He might not be doing what he ought to do, but that still does not give the Christian license to respond sinfully, to deteriorate conversations into name-calling, to committing murder in our own hearts with our rhetoric towards these governing authorities. There are right ways to handle contact with law enforcement out on the streets. Many years ago, I wrote an article titled "Hello, Officer." You will find that in various places online that gives a succinct outline as to go about handling a contact with law enforcement. If a police officer approaches you, open air preacher, on the streets, you ought to acknowledge his presence. You ought to, for that moment, stop what you're doing and engage that officer. Listen to what he has to say, determine why he's there to talk to you, and hear him out. I forget who it was, but many years ago, an officer walked up to a brother in Christ who was preaching in the open air, and the officer immediately asked, "Who's in charge here?" And the open air preacher whimsically said, "Well, you are, sir. You're in charge here." And that immediately diffused that particular situation. When the officer approaches you, you ought to acknowledge his authority. You ought to acknowledge his position. You ought to respond to him, address him or her respectfully. You should start the conversation on that good and positive note, because your goal is not to fight with the officer in front of you. Your goal isn't necessarily to win an argument with the officer. It's much easier to talk your way into the back seat of a patrol car than it is to talk your way out of a patrol car. So treat that officer like you would treat any other person according to the Word of God. Treat them respectfully. Speak to them kindly. Speak to them as an image bearer of the God who created you. Once the officer has explained why he's there, an appropriate question to ask is, "Well, officer, am I violating the law? Am I in violation of a law or an ordinance? Am I doing something wrong? Because I want to submit to your authority. I want to do what's right. I want to follow legitimate laws. So if I'm in contradiction to the law, please, officer, let me know so that I can comply if I can." And again, that will help to diffuse the situation. That would help to let the officer know that you are a reasonable person. Look, it's just as it's getting harder to preach the gospel on the streets, and just as there is more potential for having a negative encounter with law enforcement, for law enforcement, it's getting far harder to do their job out on the streets too. And so you need to take that into account as you're interacting with the officer. Once there's been some establishment as to why the officer's there and as to whether or not there is some kind of violation of law or there's not, then the conversation to progress to, "Well, officer, what is it that you are asking us to do? What is it that you want us to do?" And this is a place where many open air preachers potentially can make a mistake. Let me give you a hypothetical. You're preaching on a street where you've preached for years. You're standing in a place where you've stood for years. You happen to be standing in front of a particular business. Maybe you're 10 or 15 feet away from the door. You're on a public sidewalk. You're good there. You're not on private property. You're using amplification. You're allowed to do that. So everything is going as it ought to go. And yet the officer arrives. And the officer says, "Well, this business owner would ask that you would move maybe 10 feet away from their front door. Instead of standing right in front of their front door, they're having a hard time conducting business. They're having a hard time getting customers in because you're standing right in front of their door, blasting your amp right into their business." "No, I have the right to stand here. I know my rights." "Tyranny! I'm not going to let you be a fascist with me, you Nazi. I'm standing right here." Wrong response. Look, as many people as God ordained to hear the gospel are going to hear the gospel 10 feet away from that front door as they would if you're standing right in front of that business, right? So take the high ground and move. You're not sacrificing anything. You're not compromising the gospel of Jesus Christ. To stand there and not move is to say, "I'm here for a fight. I'm going to fight for this piece of ground. I'm not going to fight for the souls inside that building. I'm not going to fight for the soul of this officer who's contacted me. I'm going to fight for this concrete." No, be reasonable. To the extent that it's possible, be at peace with all men. The officer in that case is not asking you to stop preaching. He's not asking you to change your message. He's not threatening you with arrest or citation because of the content of your message. He's simply trying to keep the peace. And he's asking you to move 10 feet away from the door of a business so that the business owner might be able to conduct more business or quieter business. Not only by doing that, by making that move, not only are you maybe creating now rapport with that business owner, but you're creating rapport and credibility with the officer who came to talk to you. And so now the next time someone calls on you, and you know they will, someone often does, if that officer gets the call and they hear, oh, there's street preachers on Main Street, and they roll up and they see that it's you, they're going back to that last encounter they had with you and seeing that, remembering that, well, he was reasonable. He complied. He wasn't required by law to move, but he voluntarily moved to help me keep the peace. Okay, I'm going to work with this person. And you're establishing credibility and rapport with those governing authorities. Very, very important if you're out with a group of open air preachers and you're leading the group, and we're going to talk about that in another segment, but if you're leading the group, it's really important that only one person addresses the responding officer. Do not let a crowd of street preachers, do not let a crowd of church members form around that officer. Do not let other people speak unless they're spoken to by the officer. It's important that one person is designated as the leader of the group to have that communication with the officer. When you have a bunch of people talking at the same time, even if the words are friendly, it sounds like an argument. It sounds like a confrontation. And officers are geared to watch for confrontations. They're geared to watch the people in a crowd. They have a heightened sense of awareness. They have a heightened sense of potential danger. They want to go home at night, right? The fact that you might be a bunch of friendly church people may not be readily known to the officer. And now if a group is surrounding him, well, now maybe he's calling for backup. Now he's calling for more officers, and now the situation has been unnecessarily escalated. Whether you're the one leading the group or your pastor is leading the group, whoever's leading the group ought to be the one to speak to that officer. There may come a point in the conversation where the officer draws a line in the sand and he said, this is the law that I'm enforcing. This is what I'm asking you to do. These are going to be the consequences if you don't do it. And you're going to have to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to comply with those orders. To the extent that you're able, you should. If an officer comes to you and says, you are not allowed to proclaim the gospel, you could twirl pizza signs. You know, you could stand out here and shout for discounted sandwiches at Subway, but you cannot proclaim the gospel here. Well, then you have to decide whether or not you're going to obey God or you're going to obey men. But if it's an issue of amplification, or if it's something not immediately pertaining to the gospel, I believe the best course of action is to submit to the authority at that time, and then, or ask to speak to a supervisor. And if the supervisor comes out and he takes the same stance as the officer, then I think you ought to submit to that authority and then work on talking to other supervisors, other leaders in the department to see if you can't come to some kind of favorable result in that situation for when the next time the officer is called out. It's good to know the laws. Good to know the laws in your area. I remember a time when I was out with Pastor Jeff outside of an abortuary. A sergeant from that local department came up. He said, your amplifier is disturbing the business going on in a legal office next to the abortuary. I asked, well, what law are we violating? He looked it up, We had a conversation. He determined that we weren't actually violating the law by using our amplifier. And because we had an understanding of what the law was and we dealt with that sergeant in a reasonable way, he left giving us his blessing to continue doing the work that we were doing. So it is helpful, it's important to know the laws in your area. Very, very important to understand that in many cases, you're not going to win an argument with an officer on the streets. Again, it's a lot easier to talk your way into the back seat of a patrol car than out of it. And the goal is not getting arrested. Right? There are some open-air preachers out there who look for conflict with law enforcement, who want conflict with law enforcement because they hate authority, some of them. They hate authority, or they want more views on their YouTube channel, or maybe some other reason, but they want that conflict. The godly open-air preacher doesn't want conflict with the governing authorities. He wants to remain out there on the streets proclaiming the gospel, or working to save lives outside of an abortuary. His goal is not to find himself at odds with the governing authorities. So to the extent that it's possible with you, be at peace with all men. To the extent you can submit to the governing authorities without compromising the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, submit to those authorities, establish rapport with the officers in your area, establish credibility with them for your reasonableness. And one more way you can do that is if you see officers in your community away from your time in ministry, have gospel tracts on hand that are suited to give to law enforcement. Offer to buy them a lunch. Offer to buy them a cup of coffee. Thank them for their service, not as a bribe, but simply as loving your neighbor who simply is in uniform.